I assumed paper money was ancient. I assumed it had always been there, the way roads or churches had always been there. I never once stopped to wonder where it came from, who invented it, or what ordinary people did before it existed. And I have spent years studying British economic history. That is what makes the oversight embarrassing, because the truth is startling once you sit with it. England, one of the most commercially active nations on earth, had no paper money at all until 1694. Not a banknote, not a printed bill, not a single slip of paper that said this is worth £1. Nothing. For centuries, I believed, and that most folks still carry around, is that coins were always the backbone of everyday trade, and that paper simply replaced them at some point as a convenience. That is only partly right, and it misses the far more interesting story underneath. Coins were scarce, unreliable, and often physically dangerous to own. Most ordinary transactions, for most of English history, never involved coins at all. What people used instead is a story about trust, ingenuity, and the surprisingly creative ways human beings handle the problem of exchange when the tools they need simply do not exist yet. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what people actually used before paper money, why those systems worked, what finally broke them down, and precisely why 1694 was the turning point it was. You will never look at the note in your pocket the same way again. If you want a companion guide that goes deeper into the Bank of England's founding years, it is linked in the description. I will not bring it up again. Let me take you back to the beginning. For most of recorded English history, the overwhelming majority of people lived in small communities where everyone knew everyone else. In that world, the question of how you paid for something had a simple answer. You often did not pay at all, not in any immediate sense. You gave something, and you were owed something in return, and that informal ledger existed in memory and in reputation. A farmer gave a neighbor a bushel of grain in the autumn and expected help with the ploughing come spring. A miller ground your corn, and you settled the account at harvest. This was not primitive. It was rational. In a community where you lived alongside the same families for generations, your word and your standing were worth more than any coin. I find that remarkable. The foundation of early English commerce was not money at all. It was character. But character only carries you so far. As communities grew, as towns developed, as trade moved beyond the village, you needed something that could cross distances and survive between strangers. Barter, the direct exchange of one good for another, filled some of that gap, but it has an obvious problem. The person with wool who needs iron must find someone with iron who happens to need wool at exactly the same moment, in exactly the right quantities. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants, and it is as awkward in practice as it sounds. You could not build a trading economy on it. Something better was needed, and for a long time, that something was coin. England had been using metal coins since the Anglo-Saxon period, well over 1,000 years before 1694. Silver was the primary metal for most of that span, with gold coins appearing later for larger transactions. The craftsmanship of English coinage was, at its best, genuinely impressive. But coins carried problems that are easy to underestimate from where we sit today. The first problem was simply that there were never enough of them. The supply of silver depended on mining, on foreign trade, on war and its disruptions. In lean years, coin was desperately scarce. Ordinary people might go months, even years, without handling a silver coin of any meaningful size. The small change needed for daily life, the penny transactions, the halfpenny, the farthing, was in perpetually short supply. Towns and individual tradesmen sometimes struck their own unofficial tokens just to keep commerce moving. A baker in a market town might issue small lead or copper tokens, redeemable only at his own shop. These circulated locally and filled the gap, but they were not legal tender. They were barely regulated, and they depended entirely on the issuer staying in business. The second problem was clipping. This is the one that people today find hardest to grasp. Coins in this era were not perfectly machine-made discs. For much of English history, they were hand-struck, irregular, and uneven at the edges. Dishonest people discovered that you could shave or clip small slivers of silver from the rim of a coin, pass the lightened coin at face value, and quietly accumulate the clippings for melting down. Over decades, the average coin in circulation became significantly lighter than it should have been. By the late 17th century, the problem had become genuinely severe. Many coins circulating in England had lost a substantial portion of their original silver content through clipping. This meant prices were unstable, merchants were suspicious, and the simple act of paying for something became a negotiation about whether the coin being offered was genuine and full weight. Here is the forward reference I want you to hold on to. There is a direct line between the chaos of clipped coinage in the 1690s and the moment the Bank of England was created. I will come back to that connection, because it explains why 1694 happened when it did, and not a century earlier. So if coins were scarce and unreliable, and barter was impractical beyond a small community, what did people actually use? The answer for merchants and anyone engaged in trade of any scale was a system of written credit instruments. The bill of exchange was the workhorse of European commerce from the medieval period onward. Here is how it worked in plain terms. A merchant in London buys wool from a supplier in Norwich. Instead of handing over coins, he gives the supplier a written document, a bill, promising that a named agent in Norwich will pay the face amount on a specified future date. The supplier in Norwich can now use that bill himself. He can hand it to someone he owes money to. That person can hand it to someone else. The bill circulates, passes through multiple hands, and debts are settled without a single coin changing hands, until the final moment when the bill comes due and the agent in London pays out. This system was sophisticated. It required literacy, trust in the issuer, and a network of merchants who knew each other's reputations. It was not available to ordinary working people, but for the merchant class, for the wool traders and cloth exporters and importers of spices and luxury goods. Bills of exchange were the backbone of commerce. London's trade with Europe, which was substantial by the Tudor period, ran largely on paper promises, not on carts of coin rolling across the channel. For people outside the merchant class, credit still existed, but it was more personal and more local. The tradesman's book, sometimes called the shop book, was a ledger kept by every shopkeeper, tavern keeper, and craftsman in England. You bought on account, you settled at regular intervals, often quarterly or at the great annual fairs. Your name and your balance sat in that ledger, and your reputation in the community determined whether you were extended credit or not. I think about this sometimes when I hear people talk about how credit is a modern problem, something recent generations invented to live beyond their means. Credit is ancient. What changed is the form it takes, not the instinct. There is one more piece of this picture that sits right at the bridge between the old world and the new, and it involves goldsmiths. By the 17th century, London's goldsmiths had quietly evolved into something far more than jewelers and craftsmen. Because they dealt in precious metals, they had strong rooms and vaults. Wealthy individuals began leaving their coin and plate with goldsmiths for safekeeping. Much as you might deposit valuables in a safety deposit box today, the goldsmith would issue a receipt, a written note saying that the bearer of this note is entitled to withdraw a stated amount of coin on demand. Those receipts began to circulate. People passed them to others in settlement of debts, because it was easier to hand over a piece of paper than to go to the goldsmith, withdraw the coin, and then cart it to your creditor, who would then carry it back to his own goldsmith. The receipts, in other words, started functioning as money. This is one of those moments in economic history that feels almost accidental, and yet it was inevitable given the right conditions. The goldsmiths also discovered something else. Not everyone came to withdraw their coin at the same time. If you held deposits of, say, £1,000 in silver, you could safely lend out a portion of that to borrowers, charge interest, and still have enough in the vault to cover normal withdrawals. This is the basic principle of fractional reserve banking, and the London goldsmiths were practicing it decades before the Bank of England existed. They were, in a very practical sense, the first English bankers. Names like Edward Backwell and Robert Viner appear repeatedly in the records of the 1650s and 1660s as men who were simultaneously holding deposits, issuing running cash notes, and lending to merchants and even to the Crown. Backwell alone was lending Charles II tens of thousands of pounds at a time, and when the king issued his Stop of the Exchequer in 1672, essentially defaulting on roughly £1.3 million of short-term debt, it nearly destroyed the goldsmith banking network entirely. That trauma of 1672 is one of the reasons a more stable, formally chartered institution started to seem necessary to the merchants and parliamentarians who would, 2 decades later, sit down and design what became the Bank of England. Now here is where those clipped coins come back in, as I promised you. By the early 1690s, England was fighting an expensive war against France. The government's finances were in serious trouble, and the silver coinage was in a state of near collapse from decades of clipping. The Crown needed money it could not raise through taxes alone, and the banking infrastructure of the goldsmiths, while useful, was fragile and private. In 1694, a proposal was brought forward by a Scottish merchant named William Paterson. The idea was elegant. A group of private investors would lend the government around £1.25 million. In return, they would be incorporated as a bank, the Bank of England, and would be permitted to issue banknotes up to the value of their capital. Those notes would be backed by the government loan, which was itself backed by the government's taxing power. It was, when you strip it back, a circular arrangement of trust. But it worked. The Bank of England opened in 1694, and it began issuing the first standardized paper notes in English history. Those early notes were not quite what we carry today. For a long time they were partly handwritten, filled in by clerks, and made out to specific named individuals or to the bearer. They came in varying amounts and required a signature from a bank cashier. They were also not universally accepted outside London in the early years. A farmer in Yorkshire had no particular reason to trust a piece of paper from a London bank he had never heard of. Trust in paper money spread slowly, over generations, as the Bank of England demonstrated that it would indeed honour its notes on demand. It is worth sitting with that. Something we treat today as bedrock fact, that a piece of paper in your pocket is worth what it says, took more than a century to become genuinely settled common sense for ordinary English people. If you have found this kind of deep dive into the overlooked corners of British economic history useful, the community around this channel is a good place to bring your questions. You can subscribe and join the conversation. I read what folks send in, and it shapes the videos I make next. The deeper lesson I keep coming back to, after all the years I have spent with this material, is that money is never the thing itself. Money is a technology for carrying trust across time and distance. Coins worked when communities were small enough that the metal's physical value could anchor trust in a stranger. Bills of exchange worked when merchant networks were tight enough that reputation travelled. Goldsmith receipts worked when London was dense enough that a known firm's paper meant something. And the Bank of England's notes worked because, for the first time, the trust of the English government, imperfect and debt-ridden as it was, stood behind every slip of paper. Each system was solving the same problem, just at a larger and larger scale. What people actually used before paper money, then, was not one thing. It was a layered, messy, genuinely ingenious collection of workarounds, memory and reputation in the village, tallies and shop books for local credit, bills of exchange for long-distance trade, goldsmith receipts for the propertied class in London. No single tool served everyone. Different people, at different levels of the economy, operated in almost entirely separate monetary worlds simultaneously. The idea of a single national currency that everyone uses in the same way is, historically speaking, a very new idea, and in England, it barely existed before 1694. There is no great commercial interest in teaching people this history. The banks and the money printers of the world have little reason to remind you that their product is a fairly recent invention built on centuries of improvisation. But understanding where money came from gives you something quietly valuable. It reminds you that the arrangements we treat as fixed and permanent are in fact chosen, constructed, and changeable. Every generation inherits the monetary system of the one before it and tends to assume that system is simply how things are. The folks who built those systems knew better. They were improvising, just like everyone before them. This week, if you want to do something with this, simply look at a banknote. Read what it actually says. In the United Kingdom, it still carries the promise to pay the bearer on demand. That language is a direct inheritance from the Goldsmith receipts and the Bank of England's earliest notes. It is a relic of the moment when paper money had to prove itself to a skeptical public. Over this month, if the topic has caught your interest, dig a little into the great recoinage of the 1690s, the government effort to replace all those clipped coins around the same time the Bank of England was founded. The two events are deeply connected, and together they mark the true beginning of modern English money. I got this wrong for years because I never thought to ask the question. I hope this video has given you the better answer, and perhaps the habit of asking it about other things we take for granted. Leave a comment below with what surprised you most, or if your family has any stories about older ways of keeping accounts. I am genuinely curious what folks remember. Next time, we are looking at why Britain's great trading companies of the 17th century operated more like governments than businesses, and what that tells us about how empire actually gets built. If that sounds interesting, subscribe so you do not miss it. I will see you there.